It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of poetry today, but I often find myself wondering if this is a result of us misunderstanding exactly what poetry is, which is affecting how we are writing it. In short, we are producing quantity, but are we producing quality? So today I want to talk to you about not just demystifying poetry and defining what it is and what it isn't, but also how we can use these definitions to strengthen our writing practice. But first I want to know, do you feel like there's too much poetry out there today? And are you happy with contemporary poetry or not? Let me know in the comments and let's have a discussion. I find the best poetry is like a clean river. I can go over to it and dip my hands into it, pick up that crystal coolness and drink from it. In short, it nourishes me. But sometimes the rewards of poetry are hard won. Not everything comes with such ease, so it's more akin to having to hike to the river first. I think there's an element within all art that we earn our aesthetic response to it by engaging with it more often. Art doesn't just console, it challenges, it breaks down, it forges anew. It can offer us a radically different perspective that we've never thought before, or it can unlock something with us and allow us to recognize something that is already within, that has been teased out through the nature of engaging with the art of the poem. And poetry can change us when we are confronted by the new. It challenges us to change. If we are an attentive reader and are open to the fact that we do need to change over our lives, we can get a lot more out of art. So let's start with definitions. What is poetry? Poetry comes from the Greek word poesis, which means making. Therefore, poetry is a making. Broadly defined, this can be anything. This can be a storytelling, this could be sculpting. You are making something. Depending on who you ask, poetry is like making a secondary world. It's the world where the imagination and sensory experience and the emotions and the fullness of consciousness can all meet in this whirlpool. It's creative writing, it's crafting a narrative, it's storytelling, it's packing all these things into a usually condensed form that tells an emotional story or reveals an emotional truth. One where the outer objects of the poem connects with the imagination and the emotion of the listener and reader via the emotion and imagination of the writer. And making comes in different grades of quality. Imagine a table crafted from solid English oak, created by a master craftsman, or a rusty machine mass producing plastic tables. They might both be tables, but there is definitely a difference in quality and uniqueness. There is a distinction that many people like to draw between poetry and prose, but many of these distinctions don't hold up. The very nature that there's something called prose poetry shows that these are not completely opposed to each other. Prose and poetry are not opposites. What happened is there was a linguistic shift, roughly extending from neoclassicism to modernism, where prose writers simply became writers and poets predominantly became lyric writers. These are poems resembling song lyrics. And these lyrics were typically associated with meter, which is what made these poems verse. Verse is written in lines like the verses or lyrics in a song, while prose is written in sentences and paragraphs. And poems were often written in forms like sonnets or villanelles. Villanelles, for instance, are derived from French pastoral songs, a villain being a peasant or a farmer, someone who is rude and unchivalrous, hence the modern word villain. Free verse ditches meter and usually form, except for the form is a unique creation from the poet themselves, but still sticks to the rough length and style of song lyrics, most free verse poetry is relatively short. Most pop, rock, rap, hip-hop, metal all have free verse style of lyrics. So the key is that poetry uses language artfully. It is often condensed and urgent, highly aware of the sound of each word, and results from compressing language into an aesthetically pleasing form that often conveys heightened emotion. We live in an age of quantity. There's a lot of poetry in its various guises, along with all the other forms of stimulus floating out there. In one sense, it's wonderful that so many people are practicing the art, and I hope they continue to practice it. It is especially essential in this day and age that we value freedom of speech and continue to create art that is authentic, emotional, and meaningful. Poetry is fundamental in resisting the tendency of language to fall into platitudes, deceitful political rhetoric, or the language of social media, artificial intelligence, or TikTok brain rot. Another advantage of the contemporary age when it comes to poetry is that people from any different sexuality, identity, race, religion, and more can write or self-publish anything, which allows them to go beyond gatekeepers of traditional publishing. This is a democratic triumph which can break through a hegemonic and dominant cultural perspective. However, the more poetry we are inundated with, we are more likely to encounter the quantity of the art, but not necessarily the quality of the art. So it may not have lasting value, even though it may get a lot of likes, a lot of shares, a lot of comments. And as quickly as these pieces may be read or shared or liked, they can be forgotten about, lost to the washes of the internet. And this, my friends, is a problem. Although a reader, one that especially has not spent as much time with poetry, might stumble upon these spare, broken line verses that we see often on Instagram, they might feel like they're getting something out of it, but may not realize that what they're getting out of it is all that they're projecting onto it, rather than the poem itself being particularly profound. Part of this is because poetry has had its definition narrowed, and that when we see line breaks, we think, that constitutes a poem, even though poetry extends way beyond this, and the poems that we traditionally call poems that do have line breaks have a lot more going on in them than just being sentences that have just been randomly cut into something that looks like a poem. And whether these line breaks constitute a poem or not, we can also have the discussion of whether what we're reading is good or not. Now, some people are uncomfortable with saying a piece is good or not because they say everything's subjective, and you can never say objectively this is good and this isn't, though I would argue that you could make quite easy comparisons between something that you find utterly mind-blowing and something that is a lot less convincing. Of course, there is a subjective measure to what we deem good poetry. I could find something bright and illuminating and you could find it dull. I could find something spiritually refreshing and you could see it as overly sentimental or ridiculous. Each of us respond differently. However, it is undeniable that some art sustains through time for a reason. Many people, even if you don't like reading Shakespeare, are unlikely to say, what a terrible writer. You can make no objective measure on his quality or not. I've been thinking on this issue for a long time. I've read tens of thousands of poems and I've written thousands of poems, and every time I come to them, I think, what am I learning from this and how can I be a better reader and writer? The more you infuse yourself in any art, the more you start to develop taste and discernment. You learn more about what it is that you like and, perhaps more crucially, what it is that you do not like. You start to understand the construction behind poems and why they're working, whether that's to do with the sound, the rhythm, the meter, the word use, the images, the symbols, the construction of the whole poem coming out of its parts. My taste extends beyond this, but what I tend to find most interesting are poems that have mythological themes or are within like the visionary tradition. So W.B. Yeats, Kathleen Raine, Rilke, Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath even though she gets called a confessional poet, I think she has a lot more going on to her that is visionary than just confessional, but that's for another time. The visionary poetry is poetry that leaps into an inner world of dream states, mystical or religious experiences, and tries to explain our relationship to the other, something that we can't quite apprehend, but we can kind of get inferences of. Visionary poetry is something that I feel is larger than the human condition, as it often is dealing with gods and spirits and all these other things that we can argue about whether they're true or not. But they extend way beyond the smaller moments, even if the smaller moments are being explored in a poem. However, I do enjoy poetry from many traditions and forms, including romantic, haiku, modernist, and plenty more. There's no need to go into all of it now. So even if a poem deals with a subjective I and is going into smaller and quieter moments, I still want it to reflect something that is larger than itself. In short, I want the moment to become more expansive. If the poem is between two lovers and they are sitting in the kitchen and they are talking about love, I want it to be more than two lovers sitting in a kitchen and talking about love. I want it to say something about love as an archetypal human theme, even if it's explored in that smaller, intimate moment between the characters in the poem. So much of what is passed as poetry today, to my mind, is not particularly interesting. Often I have no doubt that it was interesting to the writer and that there's a sincerity behind their poems, but I think sincerity is at the heart of almost all poetry, stuff that's stronger and stuff that's weaker, and don't necessarily think that's a good way to measure the quality of a poem. Sometimes the work of a poet may be so personal in a way that I'm sure it's deeply meaningful to the writer, but there's no space for me as a reader to be able to peer into it or feel part of the experience. In essence, it's just not always that relatable, or it's so vague it's not really telling the reader anything new. Some poems are vague and they can be without much craft, even when they become viral sensations. I sometimes liken this to the Barnum effect. The Barnum effect's most typical association is with horoscopes, and that people reading the horoscopes feel like they are more personal and more relatable to them than they are because of how vague they are. It's very easy to read something that says, sometimes you're a person who can feel a lot of anger, but you press that anger down and down and down until one day it just all comes out. Did you relate to that? That's the Barnum effect. It might have felt like I was speaking absolutely about you, but I just made a general vague statement that almost all humans experience. So when there's a Barnum effect poem, I think it's asking the reader to project all the meaning into it because it's so vague it feels relatable to the reader. It is usually made without much skill from the writer and is imaginatively deficient from the writer. These vague statements or platitudes there so that they're saying, reader, do the work for me. So poetry can, and for me should, change something in us. If poetry maintains its limited definition as just a bunch of lines, I think we will continue to see more and more of this Barnum effect poetry. But what do I mean? I decided to write a very short Barnum effect poem myself because I'm not here to rag on individual writers expressing themselves, even though I would like people that are engaging with the art and writing these things to continue to improve themselves so they can write stronger, more convincing poems. So here goes. The slow ache I felt when you left me swallowed me whole. The slow ache I felt when you left me swallowed me whole.
It's not bad.
This is typical to a short poem I've read over and over. Sure, the slow ache has something in it, but when you left me, well, that's so vague. That could be a loved one breaking up with you, that could be someone dying. In this case, the ambiguity is not its strength. When you think about the slow ache of you left me, you will just start projecting your own interpretations on it, and I'm sure you'll cling to something in your own memory. Now, when we're reading poems, of course we call upon our memory and our own experiences, but when it's so nebulous and vague, again, I argue we're doing almost all the work as a reader, and that's not good. The writer creating the poem can be co-creating with the reader, but it's got to be more 50-50. Also, on the ache, swallowing the speaker, it's too obvious. Okay, it hurts when someone leaves and it feels bad, is essentially all that said. We know this. Anyone that has experienced loss knows it feels bad. There's no new interpretation on it, even though Rachel said it's not bad. If poetry is to change us, we should be challenged, given a new perspective, moved so totally we feel the cells in our blood gain a new electric current. Let's contrast what I wrote with a stronger poem example. In Seamus Heaney's poem Digging, the speaker in the poem is talking about writing a poem at the same time his father is outside digging. Here's a couple of stanzas from that poem. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound. When the spade sinks into gravelly ground, my father digging, I look down. Till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. This poem is not just a simple observation of a digging father. The speaker, the poet, too, is digging into memory, digging into emotion, digging into what is similar and what is different about the manual labor of the father outside and the intellectual labor of the poet inside. The moments happening in the poem are elevated beyond what they are describing. And I'd argue that the work of a poet is somewhat like an inner archaeologist. You are trying to go so deep to find something that is true and to reveal it through the use of beautiful, crafted, artful language. The poem ends, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. The point being, the quick 4 lines that I wrote, something that you might relate to for an instance in the moment and you bring all of your projection to, is very different than the digging poem, which has control over the images and is extremely emotive without being overly emotional, tells a story and uses rhythm and doesn't ask you to create the whole thing yourself. Let's look at another poem. I'm going to do my absolute best in the name pronunciation, but I apologize for almost certainly not getting it right. The poem's called Host by Chibueze Crouch-Anyarogbu. Host. For us, the ancestors came too early, slipping in and out of doorways, rustling like silk. Grief, a perfume lodged in our throats. For us, the heart is a continuously open wound. We mourn elders denied, making families where river meets sea, sweet, bleeding into salt. Salt, drinking in sweet until all boundaries cease. Maybe this is why we love so helplessly. stretching the word far beyond its modest capacity. There are always more names to speak alive, new gods on our altars. Many spirits who sleep in our beds, receiving our bodies as offerings. This poem takes me completely into another realm. It's like a trance state where self and other starts to dissolve, and there's a silk-like membrane between me and the spirits and the dead all feel like we're converging into one. I find this poem so incredibly moving and so well put together. This poem is not just sensorially rich, it really takes me into the depths of somewhere of what it means to be human and what is at the heart of the mystery of the human experience. There's something in it I cannot quite get words for and cannot quite describe, which is exactly what I want the poem to do. I can't describe it. The poem is the aesthetic experience in and of itself. So poetry is an art form that is best when it is savoured and considered. Poetry is urgent. It usually demands slow reading, close reading, memorization, repeated reading, consideration, thoughtfulness. It is more than a diary entry slashed into line breaks. Poetry is free to all that have access to language to speak or to write it and to share. The problem is, if we don't consider craft and consider this improving to say exactly what it is that we want to say and spend time improving so that we can write and share something that's even more worthwhile, then I think that we may be devaluing the art. So, Catch-22, free for all, beautiful, and I hope that those that are free to express it take into consideration improving and writing stronger poems, because that'll be more gratifying to you and more gratifying to your readers and listeners, even if your listeners are just your family members, a loved one, or your dog. And get all these little dopamine hits every time we get these different interactions in our poems. We're thinking, what I'm doing is working, what I'm doing is getting me popularity, maybe even fame. But is what you're doing genuinely lasting? Will anyone look at it in 100 years and think, wow? Which brings me to this point. Poetry, making something, is easy. Good poetry, making something good, is difficult. It takes work, it takes craft, it takes caring about language and the human experience and caring about your readers and listeners to craft something that is optimally engaging and challenging to them. So just as a musician, like a pianist, needs to sit at the piano and practice and learn to be better, a poet needs to sit with language and the writing and the skill and also learn to be better. We all are where we are in our journey of poetry, and there's no pressure to say, well, you're not good enough, so stop writing. But I think we should all share the ambition of, I am where I am, but I could be further along. And there are multiple ways to be further along. One of the goals of this channel, but also through reading, listening, continuous writing, and understanding poetry and making more fundamentally. And that's why I've wanted to talk today about poetry's broad and more specific definitions, because if we only see it as a bunch of line breaks, we're in trouble. If you are someone who writes poetry, is thinking about writing poetry, or is just worried about the state of poetry, I have a few questions for you that can help you move forward in your journey with the art. Also, be honest. It can be tempting to knee-jerk to just say yes to all of these questions, but take a second, consider it. You don't need to tell anyone. Because if poetry, if it's to do anything, it's to find some form of emotional truth. If you can't even be honest with where you are with the art, how are you going to be honest in your poems? Truth is important in art and outside of art. Here are the questions. Am I trying to write the best possible poetry that I can write? If no, what can I do? If yes, ask yourself again. Am I dedicated to improving myself as a poet as much as possible? Do I read and support other poets, past and present? Can I discern between a poem that I really like and one that I really do not like? And can I say why? Do I care about the art, its history, and what I am saying about it through either writing poetry or writing about poetry? Do I find language interesting? Do I really care about language? Do my poems amount to more than they're saying? Are they elevating into poetry? Have I felt changed as a result of writing the poem? If you answered no to any of these questions, that's okay. Ask yourself why and find ways that you can turn them into yeses. And remember, this isn't just a switch that you flip on and say yes once and then that's it. You can continually ask yourself these questions. These are some of the questions that I ask myself. We should also not shy away from the value of difficulty in poetry. I do not mean difficulty as in you should write really obscure poems that people come to and find difficult. I mean to get the maximum amount of richness from poems, there is a learning curve. When we learn all the different facets of how to interpret poetry in a way that feels right to ourselves, we can get more out of it. And this is difficult. This comes with learning. This comes with care and attention and really, really diving deep into the meaning of things and into ourselves. In a cultural landscape that's often geared towards immediate gratification, poetry that demands more from the reader, closer attention, intellectual engagement, and a willingness to grapple with complexity, we can receive profound and long-lasting rewards. This is not to suggest that accessibility and depth are mutually exclusive, but rather that the effort invested in navigating a challenging poem can lead to richer insights and a more meaningful aesthetic experience. One that transcends the sometimes fleeting emotional hum of simpler verse. So, as you continue your journey into poetry, I encourage you to challenge yourself, to write ever richer poems, to really take the time to read and understand how to express yourself more strongly, and be part of the solution to showcasing the highest quality poems that you can. Because my God, do we need poetry in today's day and age, and we are all nourished and enriched if the poems that we are producing are at their strongest. Whether you share your poems at open mics, traditionally or self-publish, or do whatever you want to do with your poems, just ask yourself some of those questions and continue your journey of improvement. Only then can we deal with the mounting crisis of quantity by ensuring a higher percentage of quality. If you want to learn more about poetry, subscribe and join my mailing list. It's in the description box below. See you next time. Okay, we did it.